We're live.
That's all right. Thanks, Andy. Do we have a quorum?
We do.
Awesome. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Judicial Proceedings Committee. Today is Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022. We have our annual fiscal briefing today. Ms. Ruff right here with us. Welcome. And then after she finishes, we'll jump off of this link and onto another link for our bill hearings. And today we have 7 bills. I'll reintroduce the order when we get over to the next link. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ms. Ruff. Thank you so much for joining us and for providing us with this brief. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to inform you on what's going on with this year's budget as introduced by the governor. Again, I'm Rebecca Ruff. I'm one of the operating budget managers for the Department of Legislative Services. And I believe we have a document that has been shared with all of you, but we will provide it on the screen, and that's what I will speak from. So very different from the last time that I presented to you at last session. The state is now facing extraordinarily positive fiscal times, unlike anything that we've seen, I'm told, in at least the past 30 years. Going into this session, we were estimating a $4 billion surplus, which is very, very different than the story that we all thought we were facing last session. And so with this surplus that allows the governor to do 3 kind of key things with the budget that he's brought for you all to consider this year. And that is to implement or propose significant tax relief, to include in the budget substantial amounts of additional spending, and also include significant amount of funds set aside for future use down the road. If you look at the top half of page 1, you'll see a summary of how the spending plan changes from the current fiscal year, fiscal 2022, into the proposed allowance for fiscal 2023. What we see when we look across all funds is that the budget actually declines by nearly $3.6 billion, or about 6%. And what that's really reflective of is the nearly $7.8 billion reduction in federal funds, largely associated with one-time federal stimulus assistance. And that nearly 31% decrease is offset by about a 22% increase in general fund spending in the budget. And there's a couple things going on with that. A portion of that increase is associated with having to backfill some of that federal fund spending, but also included in that is a $2.4 billion appropriation to the state's rainy day fund in accordance with statute because of a significantly higher than anticipated fiscal 2021 closeout with our general fund revenues. If you take that $2.4 billion appropriation out of the equation, what we see is general fund growth that is actually around 13.3% rather than the 22%. One other thing that I would note before we move to the next page is that not reflected in the budget currently is any funding associated with the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The timing of the enactment of that legislation has just not allowed the administration to reflect any funding in this year's budget, although the potential exists that we will see some of those funds recognized through future supplementals. Turning to page 2. This highlights for you a little bit of what the governor is proposing in terms of tax relief. He has 3 primary pillars in his tax relief package. The biggest being the phase out of the income tax on retirement income. By our initial reading of the proposal, this would be a phase out of all retirement income. The plan itself is supposed to be phased in beginning in fiscal 2023 with an estimated revenue loss of $188 million, which grows to reduced revenues of about $730 million by fiscal 2027. But really, the proposal doesn't get fully phased in until fiscal 2028, which is outside of the administration's general fund forecast. The second proposal in his tax relief package is to eliminate the filing fees for businesses who file online. Currently, they pay around $300 annually. And so this would reduce general fund revenues by $36 million in the allowance year and growing to $48 million in fiscal 2027. And then finally, the governor is proposing to make permanent the enhancement to the earned income tax credit that was established last year. And so there is no savings in the current year's allowance because the legislation passed last year carries through calendar year or tax year 2022, but it would generate a reduction in revenue of $164 million by fiscal 2027. So on the next page, this gives you an idea of where the state stands in terms of the structural budget. So obviously the requirement is year to year to be balanced on a cash basis. But so what this does is gives you an indication of how the governor's budget plan, whether it's really affordable for us looking forward into the future. Now, the way to view this chart is that the solid black line and the blue bars are linked. This shows you where we would be in terms of our structural surplus if with and without the tax cut. So the line represents where we would be if there was no tax cuts implemented. And then the blue bars represent where the administration's plan puts us if you were to adopt the governor's proposed tax package. And you can see that they are in fact proposing or estimating a structural surplus through fiscal 2027. Now, the gray bars and the dotted line are where DLS differs a little bit from the administration's estimates. And you can see that because of differences largely with the costs associated with education aid, particularly in the out years, we are estimating that we will see a structural deficit beginning in fiscal 2027. And I would just note for you that what's not reflected in this chart is the fact that the structural situation is likely to be worsened if you were to extend this forecast out one more year. And that's for two reasons. One, because fiscal 2028 would reflect the full phase-in of the governor's elimination of the income tax on retirement income. And also because fiscal 2028 is when we really see the impact of needing general funds, significant general funds, to support the implementation of Kerwin legislation. So on the next slide, this at the top gives you a little bit of an indication or provides you with a picture as to how the governor's allowance allocates the $4 billion surplus that we had going into the session. And you can see that about $2.4 billion, as I mentioned, is set aside in the rainy day fund, leaving that fund with about a balance equivalent to 16% of general fund revenues, which is extraordinarily high. The last time that we had a balance above 11% was about in, I think, around fiscal 2007. So this is pretty unprecedented to have such a significant amount of funds set aside. The governor does close fiscal 2023 with an estimated fund balance of about $584 million. And so that's about $315 million above where we anticipated when DLS did our baseline estimate back in the fall. We do see some spending enhancements that we hadn't necessarily accounted for in our baseline budget, and that largely applies to employee compensation, an additional $100 million provided for cybersecurity, and also some funds for to help childcare providers. The other big pot of funds included in the budget that we hadn't previously anticipated is $910 million in PAYGO spending that the governor has included in the capital budget to bring total capital spending over $2 billion for fiscal 2023. So just to hit a couple of highlights, that's the bullets that you see at the bottom of the page and carrying on to the next page. K-12 education funding grows by about 3.5%, although it is worth noting that there is a component of the Kerwin legislation that is not funded in this year's budget, the education effort adjustment. This would have provided about $125 million to assist Baltimore City and Prince George's County. In total, we estimate that underfunding for Kerwin is about $140 million. And that's largely to do with a difference of opinion with the administration as to whether the education effort adjustment was actually mandated for fiscal 2023. We're getting input from the AGs on that particular issue, so stay tuned. The budget provides increases for healthcare providers, receiving at least a 3.2% increase, some of them all the way up to 4%. There's over $100 million in funding for increased funding for crime prevention and victim services. And I know that's of particular interest, so I will have a specific slide relating to those programs a little bit later on. And as I mentioned, there's $110 million for cybersecurity issues and evaluations for state agencies included in the budget. On the next slide, to continue with some of the highlights, funding for USM grows by about 19%. And so this does a lot to backfill from previous reductions that the university system absorbed when we thought the fiscal situation was much more dire. And as a result of those increases, because community colleges are impacted by the amount of funding with the formulas that's provided to the four-year institutions, we also see substantial increases for the community colleges as well in fiscal 2023. There's about $832 million provided for compensation enhancements for state employees. There is additional detail provided in the document if you are interested in exactly which units of government receive which enhancements. But in general, most employees receive significant bonuses in the current fiscal year, as well as cost of living adjustments and increments, and those carry forward into fiscal 2023. With regard to the capital budget, I would just note that the governor's proposal does include $50 million in GO bonds reserved for legislative priorities, and also funds an additional $51 million in prior authorizations identified by the legislature from last session. Turning now to some of the key issues that we think the legislature will need to consider in making their decisions on the budget. Number one, you all will obviously have to decide what you want to do in response to the governor's proposals for tax relief. You'll also want to consider where the appropriate balance is in terms of what should be reserved for future use, how much should be kept in the rainy day fund. It's very common amongst states to maintain a balance of at least 10% to protect against future recessions. However, as noted, the governor has included a balance closer to 16%. On the next slide, continuing with the issues, as I mentioned, there is some identified underfunding of Kerwin legislation, and we'll have to figure out how to address those issues. To the extent that funds become available or the opportunities present themselves, you may wish to opine on how to spend the infrastructure money that the state expects to receive. I think in total, we're currently estimating with what we know that Maryland will receive about $8.2 billion over the next 5 years. About $1.5 billion of that is new or enhanced funding beyond what we would have already anticipated to receive. You'll have to consider the long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund as you consider exactly what the overall funding picture should be for the state and the use of the excess surplus funds that we have available to us this year. And then finally, one other issue that relates to funding but does have some non-compensation components to it is issues with state hiring and retention. This isn't an issue that is unique to the public sector. The Great Resignation is occurring all over the place, but it is impacting state government and state agencies' abilities to attract and retain their staff. And so while there are considerable compensation enhancements provided in this budget, most state agencies are facing vacancy rates that exceed 10%. And so you may want to consider what type of programs are available for additional compensation, targeted compensation, or even non-compensation options to help improve the state workforce. Just to give you a little bit more detail on what the governor is doing to enhance funding for public safety and crime prevention, if we want to jump to page 17. The governor announced prior to introducing his budget that he was funding a $500 million Refund the Police initiative. And so the details provided by the administration are outlined for you in the top half of this chart. As you can see, it's a multi-year plan to reach that $500 million in spending. Only about 30% of that is funded in the current budget, with $155 million spread across fiscal 2022 and 2023. The $18 million in combined funding provided in fiscal 23 for the police scholarships and the police accountability resources, which are body cams and equipment and training and whatnot. Those are actually provided in the budget in order to fulfill legislative requirements established through the Maryland Police Accountability Act from last session. There is additional funding provided for victim services and VOCA providers. The majority of this enhancement is provided in fiscal 2022. The $20 million provided in the current year actually reflects federal funds that are brought in to make VOCA providers whole for the current fiscal year. And then the fiscal 23 allowance does maintain that same level of funding for VOCA of about $48 million, little less than $48 million in fiscal 23. The $6 million for victim services is general fund enhancements, and they are allocated to the programs that you see in the bullets there in the middle of the page. The biggest component of the governor's Refund the Police initiative is an enhancement to the state aid for police protection formula, which provides a $45 million increase in fiscal 2023. This increase is spread across all jurisdictions, with the bigger counties receiving increases between $6 and $8 million. And also new for this year, for fiscal 2023, is the inclusion of $8 million for Baltimore City, who had previously not been included in the police aid formula going back over 30 years when the state took responsibility for the Baltimore City jail operations in lieu of receiving funding through the police aid formula. Outside of the Refund the Police initiative, the governor does provide enhancements. Several of the policing agencies receive reduced turnover to help them fill existing vacancies. There is an $8 million increase in the grants awarded for justice reinvestment. There is a full funding of $4.7 million provided for the violence intervention and prevention program. There's $2.5 million provided for rape kit testing grants. And then there's also an additional $2 million provided for the protection against hate crimes grants, which brings funding for that program all the way up to $5 million. And unless there is any questions, that concludes my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ms. Ruff. We have a couple of appropriators on the committee, and I see a question from one of them. So Senator Hettleman, go ahead. This is most informative, so thank you very much for taking the time to brief us here today. All right, Senator.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I have three hopefully quick questions. One is the police aid increase. Is that go mostly to salaries?
The police aid goes to the local governments. I would have to check with our local government unit to see the extent to which we monitor how that individual grant is allocated. I believe it's up to the local jurisdictions. Okay. I'm not sure that it goes into a specific pot of funds that we receive object.
Okay. And can you answer questions about the capital budget?
Maybe.
Good try. Okay, so I have heard that there is in the budget some funding for a new police lab, a new police lab. And I was wondering, A, if you could tell me a little bit about that. Is that just planning money, or is that, and kind of what the time horizon is that? And two is whether there is any money to fund personnel at that.
That I do not know off the top of my head. There is, I have not personally looked into it at that level. Obviously it'll be addressed in the capital analyses if it's for state police, then it'll be addressed in the capital analysis for the Department of State Police. If it is for a local lab, then it would be likely addressed through miscellaneous grant analysis. But prior to that, we can certainly look for that funding and determine whether there's any additional positions provided for it. I can have the analyst
That would be great. I just know that and my understanding is that it's for another state lab. I know the state labs, the state lab and the local labs, many of them are just so backed up right now, both because there are increased, asks of them, as well as it is very difficult to find people with the expertise to hire to be able to expand their workforce. So that's something that I've heard from folks on the ground, and adding that capacity would just go a long way to, I think, addressing some of the crime stopping issues that we might have. I'm going to turn if my last question doesn't have to do with JPR focused issues, but am I correct in thinking that the tax relief that the governor is proposing for seniors and senior retirees specifically is not at all targeted? So that somebody who is incredibly wealthy get tax relief under this proposed, is that correct?
Our initial read of the bill is that it is all retirement income by the time the phase out, so that all retirement income would be.
All retirement income, no matter whether you're have nothing in the bank or whether you have millions socked away.
That's our initial read of the bill, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Hedelman. We'll now go to Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your report, Rebecca. One quick question related to the education effort adjustment component of Kerwin, and this is my most asked question. Can you just explain to me once again why the governor took out the 26 million for Prince George's and the 99, I think, million for Baltimore City?
So our understanding is that for fiscal 2023 only, administration determined that it was not mandated and therefore opted to not fund it. As I said, we are working with the Attorney General to get an official opinion on that. We feel pretty favorable that it will be determined to be a mandate and therefore need to be funded in fiscal 2023, but we don't have an official determination of that yet. The funding does appear in the out years of the administration's forecast, so it's only for fiscal 23.
So is there any truth to this statement I'm about to say? Is it because a portion of the blueprint funds for a county provided a certain portion to be matched, and there was not the belief that Prince George's County, because of trim and other things that are in place, could not raise the revenue on their side to get this match, therefore it was removed?
I can't speak to that one way or the other. The only information I have is that the administration believed it to not be a mandate and therefore opted to not fund it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Senator Watson. We'll now go to Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start by following up with one of Senator Hedelman's questions, and that relates to retirement income. When I think of retirement income, I think of Social Security, pension that you're entitled to, that sort of thing. I do not think of having my own stocks and bonds and receiving income from my own passive income from my own investments. So when you said that it applies to retirement income, do you mean the former Social Security and pension, or do you also include the latter, your personal income from your personal investments in stocks and bonds?
I have not personally done a review of the proposed legislation, so I would need to have someone else from our staff follow up on specifics.
Okay.
proposal.
Because I sort of understood Senator Hiddleman's question is getting to the latter part question and wondering whether people were quite wealthy and have a lot of money salted away in stocks and get a lot of income from the stocks, whether that income was going to suffer a reduction in taxes. I'm not sure that, I think that would be more problematic, but if we're taking the Social Security income and the pension income that are coming to someone because they are retired, that would make more sense to me. If you maybe could get back to us and give us the answer to that, that'd be helpful. Another one you're probably going to get back to us about. I've always been interested and never got the answer as to how much Kerwin is going to cost us on a year-by-year basis during the continuum of the years covered by Kerwin. So I would love it if your organization could get to us. 2023, Kerwin's going to cost so much money. 2024, it's going to cost so much more money. So we can see how the bell curve swings upwards as we get into the out years. That would be helpful to me. And then finally, we've been dealing in this committee with funding free counsel for tenants. And there's a lot of federal money coming in terms of tenant relief. I would love to get from DLS a easy to understand statement of how much federal money in tenant relief would be available if one were so disposed to support counsel for tenants in rent eviction cases. I know that it's a subset of the total amount of federal government money in tenant relief that's coming to the state, but I've never been able to get a handle on exactly how much we're talking about in fiscal year 2022, 2023, and 2024. If you could get back to us with that information, that would also, I think, be very helpful to us.
Sure, we can provide that too.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator West. All right, turn to the rest of the committee for questions. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to brief us. We obviously don't get as much exposure as some of the other committees to the budget. And so this is always very, very instructive for all of us. So thank you for taking the time to do that.
Thank you very much for having me. If you need anything further, we're always here.
Excellent. We'll give you a holler. All right. With that, that'll conclude the briefing. So we'll switch over. You all should have received the link to our public hearings. We have 7 bills. I'll introduce them at the top when we see you over there in the other room. So see you in a few seconds.